I am pleased to introduce Mr. Nick Pope. Nick is another familiar face seen on innumerable television shows and documentaries, best known as the former leader of the British government's UFO investigation program. But he is also a well-known author all around, international expert on UFOs. We are so pleased to welcome Mr. Nick Pope.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and I would like to thank everyone who has worked so hard to put on this conference, everyone at MUFON New Mexico, everyone else associated with the venue, all the IT experts, AV, etc., etc. So thank you very much for all your hard work. I have the easy job. I think the first thing that I'm going to do is try to answer the question that really has been posed in the title of this event today. What does the government really know? What does the government really know about UFOs? And this may seem a little bit about face. I'm going to give you my brief answer to that now, and then I'm going to get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation. My answer to the question, what does the government really know about UFOs, is more than they let on, but maybe not quite as much as some people think. And I think that that actually resonates with though I know that they have different views on some aspects, but I think it does resonate with certainly some of the things that John and Nick were saying. So this is the fictional version. And when we ask this question, what does the government know about UFOs? And as you know from the intro, my background is that I worked for the British government for 21 years in the Ministry of Defence, which is our equivalent of your DOD here. And this is the fictional version of what a government UFO project looks like, and this is the actual version of what a government UFO project looks like. And that's me back when I had black hair. And this is what this subject does to you. That was my boss. Oh, not really. This again is fictional. I'm just putting this in for a little bit of fun to show you the difference between the fact and the fiction. This is the fiction of what a government archive looks like. And this next slide is the reality. Oh, okay. That's a promotional shot from a TV show that I did at the UK's National Archives. I'm going to be getting on with that. The important thing about all of this is really to say that fact, in relation to the X-Files, never meets fiction. Okay, I'm going to stop clowning around now. When we ask what the government knows about UFOs, one of the central beliefs in all of this is that there is a vast and nebulous conspiracy to cover up some terrible, profound, sinister truth about UFOs and to keep it from the media and from the public. And I know a lot of people in this room probably believe that. And in a sense, I like to say that there is a cover-up of sorts about UFOs, but it's what I call a soft cover-up, not a hard cover-up. I can only obviously speak really about the position in the United Kingdom in terms of what I've had direct responsibility for. And as I mentioned, I worked for the British government for 21 years at the Ministry of Defence as a civilian employee. 3 years of that 21-year career were spent on the Ministry of Defence's UFO project. We did not, hand on heart, have a crashed spaceship hidden away in an Air Force hangar anywhere. Or if we did, they didn't tell me. But that is a quote from a now declassified British government document where it basically says, yes, our policy is to downplay our involvement with this. And I want to give you some tangible examples of this as the presentation goes on and as we get into some cases. But this is basically the Ministry of Defense saying, yeah, we're not going to tell the public everything about this. So that's why I call it a kind of soft cover-up, not hard cover-up. That, in a single soundbite, is the Ministry of Defence's public position on UFOs, pushed aggressively over many, many years with the British Parliament, the media, and the public. It's this glib soundbite that UFOs are of no defense significance and only of very little defense interest. And it has been trotted out for decades. And I'm sorry to have to confess, but of course when I was doing that job, I probably wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters to people where I trotted out that phrase myself. The reality is actually a little bit different. The work that I did is broadly comparable to the work done by the now defunct USAF program, Project Blue Book. But unlike the American program, ours ran for 56 years. It generated around 60,000 documents, and some of them fairly highly classified. So, you know, think back to that no defense significance soundbite that we routinely trotted out, and then we dismissed the whole phenomenon really in 3 words. And yet, behind the scenes, this was the reality of the situation. So I guess it's a cover-up of sorts. That's just to show you the headquarters building, Ministry of Defence main building on Whitehall in London, where I spent most of my 21-year career. And appropriately enough, when I was on the UFO project, I was on the 8th floor, which is about as high as it gets. Maybe they figured I needed to be high up. But our job on the UFO project was to research and investigate the phenomenon, to see whether any of the sightings reported posed any threat to the defense of the United Kingdom, or might be useful to the Ministry of Defense in any other way, in terms of, for example, general scientific knowledge. And again, I'm going to get onto some specifics of what governments are really interested in when it comes to UFOs a little later on, when I get to talk about a declassified intelligence study, which is possibly the most significant document when it comes to explaining what governments do in relation to this topic and why. We investigated around 200 to 300 sightings each year, and we had a number of different ways that we would actually do our investigations. Firstly, obviously, we would interview witnesses, get the story, and then we would basically run a whole series of checks, and we would see if we could correlate the sighting reports that we had received with anything that we knew about already or could find out about. And part of that, a big part of that, obviously, was looking at military radar data to see whether visual sightings could be corroborated by anything that we tracked. But we had a number of other things that we could do. We liaised with the astronomical community, specifically at the Royal Observatory Greenwich, to see whether astronomical explanation could explain any sightings. We liaised with the meteorological office, again, to see whether any weather phenomena might have had a bearing on this. We knew every single flight path, civilian flight paths, military flying exercises, low-flying training. We knew where all the weather balloon launch sites were. We knew where, if there was anything flying, we either knew about it or could find out about it. And one part of that was actually the Ballistic Missile Early Warning Center at an Air Force base called Fylingdales. And I just put that up to show you the radomes in the background, but I also put it up because it's just a wonderful shot of two Vulcan bombers, a truly iconic British warplane that has, I suspect, on occasion been mistaken for a UFO itself. Marvelous aircraft. But the point again there is to say that when we were investigating UFOs, as we were doing this from within government, we clearly had access to resources that were not available to civilian UFO research groups. The military radar and Fylingdales, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning Center, of course, had space tracking radar. And all this could be brought to bear on our investigations. And we amassed, as you saw in one of the previous slides, tens of thousands of documents about this, some at fairly highly classified level. And our conclusions were that around 80% of UFO sightings could be explained with high degree of confidence as misidentifications of known objects and phenomena, or as hoaxes, or in a small number of cases, some sort of psychological delusions. In around 15% of cases, there was insufficient data to make any meaningful assessment, and in around 5% of cases, we didn't know, unexplained. Now, it's important to stress, unexplained does not equal extraterrestrial spacecraft. That does not mean we thought that 5% of UFO sightings were extraterrestrial, nor does it mean we necessarily thought one case was extraterrestrial. Unknown means unknown, nothing more, nothing less. Flipping it the other way, what that did mean is that we could not entirely rule out the possibility that some UFOs were extraterrestrial, or indeed attributable to some other exotic, unknown phenomena. And I use phenomena because, echoing something Nick said, just at the concluding of his presentation, there is not necessarily going to be one single neat mystery, answer to the UFO mystery. Chances are a number of different things are going on. And if there is an anomalous explanation, there's not necessarily going to be a single anomalous explanation. There may be multiple phenomena at work, all unknown. And we had some pretty good cases. We had plenty of sightings from police officers, pilots, military personnel, plenty of sightings where visual reports were corroborated by radar evidence, and where the combination of, say, pilot and radar told us that, yes, something was performing speeds and maneuvers that we couldn't match. And certainly in the UK, and I know elsewhere, there were several cases over the years where military jets were scrambled as a result of uncorrelated targets tracked on radar, when the pilots then acquired the object or phenomena on its airborne radar, and then the pilots sometimes got a visual as well. And sometimes, you know, veritable games of cat and mouse would play themselves out in the skies over the UK. And of course, we were well aware that it had gone on in other countries too. Okay, here's a little quiz question. What sci-fi movie is that picture from? Anyone know? Anyone? Okay, it's a trick question. It's not from a sci-fi movie at all. That's real. It's actually an unmanned aerial vehicle codenamed Tyrannus, named for the Celtic god of thunder. And I'm very pleased to say, it's British. You know, Britannia may not rule the waves anymore, but, you know, maybe we've got a fair chance of saying we rule the skies. I think sometimes you'll hear a lot about stealth and things, but hey, us Brits are still in the game. Does that remind you of anything? That picture I stole from the Ministry of Defence website, but it's out there. It's all, you can find it yourself. It's all declassified and released. What I think's interesting is that when they rolled out the prototype, it's patently obvious that the Ministry of Defence, Royal Air Force, and BAE Systems personnel involved in the launch were playing to the image of a spaceship in a hangar quite deliberately. Now again, I put that out there just to make a couple of points. Firstly, I mean, again, going back to those humorous slides at the beginning, the boundaries between fact and fiction in this subject can sometimes be a little blurred, and sometimes fact can masquerade as fiction, and sometimes fiction can segue into fact. But here we have Air Force and government people quite deliberately playing to the hilt the flying saucer in a hangar meme. And it is a meme. And that's an example of government doing it. Do they know something? Are they trying to tell us something? Or are they just making sure that it's a very visual image that's going to get into the papers and send the message that they want in terms of force projection? And just in case, I mean, the other reason I put that up is to say that, of course, some UFO sightings, some of the most interesting cases are going to turn out to be sightings of secret prototype aircraft and drones. There is a lead time. There's a kind of period of maybe 10, maybe 15, depends who you ask, years difference between things that we have that we don't declare necessarily and things that are on the evening news and flying at the air shows. And again, depending on which aviation expert you ask, but you'll often hear people say, oh, we've got things flying that you won't see or hear about acknowledged for 10 or 15 years. So if we've got this sort of thing now that they're showing us, what are we not being shown? And could any of that explain some of the UFO sightings? And by the way, just to show you one more image from the Ministry of Defence, this is an image that I took off the Ministry of Defence website about a couple of months ago. And it is a conceptual project being worked on by a joint, it's a joint Anglo-French initiative. I think, again, I put those two slides up to really to send the message that there are things flying around or certainly on the drawing board, that look to all the world like everybody's idea of what an extraterrestrial spacecraft looks like. I mean, doesn't that, you know, it looks like it comes straight out of Star Trek. And yet it's from the Ministry of Defense website. I want to get into a particular case now, firstly because it's an interesting case, and secondly because it's a case that shows how the government can spin the UFO subject. And again, this plays into this idea of downplaying the subject. I mean, you know, I'm sure everyone can see the central absurdity that if UFOs were really, as the Ministry of Defense said, of no defense significance, we wouldn't have generated 60,000 documents on the subject. The MOD is in the final stages of what will actually be an 8-year program to declassify and release its entire archive of files. And this is an image from one of the files. And it's a case, it's not hugely known outside the UK, but some of you may have come across it. It's called the Calvine Incident. In August of 1990, 2 hikers in Scotland were walking in open countryside when they saw a large diamond-shaped object hovering maybe 200 feet above the ground. They saw in the background a military jet, but they weren't sure whether the jet was circling it in an attempt to intercept it or whether it was escorting it. I talked about this case because the file had been declassified, and one of the things that I had said was that for many years I had a blown up image of a photograph on my office wall, but that and I said, I can't wait for this file to be declassified because wait till people see that UFO photo, it'll be great. And whatever you think about UFOs, it will certainly, you know, I think cause some interesting debate. Well, when the Ministry of Defense declassified the file and released it, that is the only image that they released. And what it is that sometimes for the purpose of calculating the precise dimension of something shown in a photograph, you will do a line drawing of it. So various imagery analysis specialists in an organization called JARIC, Joint Aerial Reconnaissance and Intelligence Center, did a line drawing, and this is a poor photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of one of the line drawings. What message does that send to the public? It sends the message, oh well, you know, if that's their best UFO photo, I'm not very impressed. Which again is consistent with the MOD's line of trying to downplay the subject. I called foul. I said, wait a minute, that's, you know, there's a much better photo than that around. And the Ministry of Defense said that they had lost it. And I asked whether they could look for it, and they looked for it, but they said they couldn't locate it. There's quite a long history of losing things like that in the Ministry of Defense. One of my favorite stories related to a sighting from a British warship, HMS Manchester, and Lord Hill Norton, a former chief of the defense staff who went on to be extremely interested in UFOs after he stepped down as CDS. And chief of the defense staff, by the way, is the British post, which is the equivalent of the US position of chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So he was a 5-star Navy admiral, and he asked for the Ministry of Defense, he said, I've been told that the crew of this warship had a UFO encounter, and it was tracked on the ship's radar. A lot of the sailors saw it visually. Some of the other ships in the NATO exercise saw it too. Can I have, under the Freedom of Information Act, the ship's log? Lord Hill Norton, retired 5-star admiral, was told that the ship's log for the period of time in question had been accidentally blown overboard by a freak gust of wind. Incompetence? Conspiracy? I don't know. But that's the only image that survived. And by the way, one time I was, with my boss, I was getting a briefing over in the Defense Intelligence Staff. And the DIS also had a large blown up copy of this photo. So if they genuinely lost it, they didn't just lose one, they lost at least two. And throughout the briefing, the intelligence briefer kept using the phrase, these people. He said, well, these people flying the craft like this, he said, we want to know, what they're doing. And yet, throughout the entire briefing, nobody actually said, what do you mean, these people? But maybe he came close to disclosing his personal views when he said, look at that photo. He said, and he pointed, and he said, it's not the Americans, it's not the Russians, and that only leaves. We kind of looked at his finger, we looked up at the ceiling, and nothing was said. It's the great taboo, even in government, to say the dreaded word alien or extraterrestrial. Hell, we didn't even say UFO. A lot of the time we said UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, particularly in our internal documents. In case you're wondering what it really looked like, earlier this year I flew to LA with a TV show, and they hooked me up with a graphic artist. We got beforehand all the declassified MOD documents, and including that image, and I then sat down with the graphic artist, and over a period of hours, using his skill and my recollection, I mean, this image was on my office wall for 3 years. I remember it. And we used that combination to recreate the image in the TV show. And what we came up with was this. That's what it really looked like. That's the best UFO government photo. That is the best photograph that the UK government ever had and says that it's lost. So there you are. We didn't know what it was. So sometimes the government knows that there's something that's not ours, but we don't know. I can tell you what UFOs aren't, but I can't tell you what they are. I can tell you that some are unidentified, but even we in the government didn't really know what we were dealing with. Another good case is the Rendlesham forest incident. I'm not going to have time to do a detailed talk about that. A lot of you are familiar with it. There's been a huge upsurge of TV shows on it recently. But again, this is Jim Penniston's sketch of the UFO. And this, for those of you that don't know, this wasn't lights in the sky. This thing actually landed in a small clearing in the forest. I'm just going to pick out the key points. He got so close to this thing that he touched the side of it and he saw strange symbols on the side. Well, when we we make our aeroplanes, even when we make our drones, we tend to put something like USAF on the side of them. We don't tend to put this on the side of our planes. Back to the central theme of this conference today. What does the government really know? There are an awful lot of fake UFO documents doing the rounds. All the extracts that I'm going to show you here are from the government's own files on the government's own website. So there is zero doubt about the provenance. And indeed, although the Rendlesham forest incident took place before my tour of duty, I had the file in my office. I remember the papers. And this was one of the most intriguing ones. And it talks about CINCUSAFE visiting the twin bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge, where this UFO encounter took place, shortly afterwards, being briefed on the incident and taking back with him to his headquarters in Ramstein, Germany, various items of evidence pertaining to the investigation. And I don't know, that last sentence is a nice piece of British diplomatic understatement. But let me tell you that we were pretty darn furious that evidence relating to a case that occurred on British soil was being removed from the country without being shared to us. But that's our jolly piece of British understatement there. Perhaps, if it's not too much trouble, we might see this too. After all, it is our country. One of the great things about the Rendlesham forest incident and the fact that it was a landing and not just lights in the sky was that afterwards the United States Air Force personnel involved in this went back to the landing site. They found 3 indentations in the frozen ground in the clearing, right where John Burroughs and Jim Penniston said that this UFO had landed. The disaster preparedness officer was one of the people who went out there, and he took with him a Geiger counter. They recorded some radiation levels, and that assessment of the radiation levels is from the Ministry of Defence, the UK MOD's Defence Intelligence Staff, the scientific and technical intelligence specialists who look at the UFO phenomenon within the United Kingdom. So the fact that this was a landing enabled soil samples to be taken, the radioactivity levels, and by the way, there was not just radioactivity on the ground, but on the sides of the trees facing the clearing. And those trees were also scorched and burnt black, as if there had been a high heat source there. Again, this is all from a declassified and released Ministry of Defence file on the incident. So it's not just something that's out there on the internet. It is in the British government's National Archives. One more point on Rendlesham. Just go back to CINCUSAFE visiting to be briefed on this incident. Sometimes with UFO cases, I think we don't see the wood for the trees. CINCUSAFE, by the way, at the time was General Gabriel, who died some years ago. But in a sense, the real central point that I think is most interesting about CINCUSAFE is not that necessarily he took items relating to the case back to his headquarters in Germany, but that he was involved at all. Because wait a minute, those of you who are conversant with this will know full well the public position of the United States government is, we don't do UFOs anymore. We're not interested. We don't investigate. After Project Blue Book was terminated at the end of '69, that was it. If that's the case, why is the senior ranking USAF general in Europe flying in to be briefed on a UFO encounter just days after it's occurred? And why is he taking possession of items pertaining to the investigation, taking them back to his headquarters in Germany? So again, that's why I say the answer to the question, what does the government really know about UFOs, is more than they're telling us. But whether the government itself knows the answers, I don't know. The British government doesn't. I can't speak, of course, for the United States. Project Condign was an intelligence study into the UFO phenomenon carried out by the Defense Intelligence Staff in the Ministry of Defense. And I was involved in the early to mid-90s in the work that led to the setting up of this study. But I had been posted from the UFO project by the time the study was actually carried out. Project Condign was an attempt to do a proper intelligence assessment of the UFO phenomenon. And that's why I say that in many respects it's one of the final report. This is a scan of the front image, the front page of the final report. The Condign report, the final report, is arguably one of the most important UFO documents of all time. And it ran to over 468 pages, I think. At the time, its classification was secret, UK eyes only. And I mean, when I say an intelligence assessment on this, what do I mean? I mean, instead of the work that I did on the UFO project, which was investigating sightings as they came in on a one-by-one basis, trying to give my best assessment of what the solution was in any particular case, a proper intelligence assessment attempted to draw together all the data that we had and really answer the more important strategic question. What is all this? You know, never mind the case-by-case analysis. Put it all together. What have we got? What are we dealing with? Is it hostile? Is it under intelligent control? What is it? And Project Condign's final report has been partially declassified and released. Some bits of it have still not been released. John Burroughs and Jim Penniston for many years had health issues which they associated with their UFO encounter, and which specifically they believed came from their proximity to it. And they knew that a Geiger counter had been used to take readings, and they knew about that Defense Intelligence Staff document. And for many years, John and Jim were battling the VA to get proper treatment. Now, they couldn't get treatment without a proper diagnosis, and they couldn't get a diagnosis because the USAF would not release their military medical records. And they had hit a complete brick wall on this until a combination of myself working with a crusading attorney called Pat Frascogna, who has done hundreds of hours of pro bono work on John and Jim's behalf and is a real hero in this story, drew John and Jim's attention specifically to this paragraph in Project Condign's final report. Now, bear in mind, this was a British intelligence study, highly classified. At the time it was written, it was never conceived that it was going to be released. And essentially it says, yeah, the witnesses that encountered the UFO in Rendlesham Forest were probably irradiated by it. Once John and Jim's attorney put that document to the VA and said, hey, wait a minute, you've denied, the US government has denied that this ever took place. You might want to read this British intelligence assessment. Guess what? The VA settled. Now, I think that's a reminder of two things. Firstly, that sometimes the answers are there, but you've got to go look for them. And this was tucked away in working paper 3 to Annex F to volume 3 or something like that. And sometimes, as I know full well, and then John will be very familiar with this, sometimes the best place to hide a book is in a library. That was there. That had actually been, that part of Project Condign's final report had been declassified since 2000. Pardon me, since 2006. But it was only fairly recently that John and Jim's attorney were able to put that to the VA, and on the basis of that, the VA settled. The second thing, of course, that story should tell us is that, my goodness, we do owe a debt of loyalty to those who have served in the military. And I think that what happened to John and Jim and others was nothing short of shameful. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we forget that the loyalty that flows up the chain of command from people like John Burroughs and Jim Penniston also is owed the other way down, from the top down. Just to show you the headline conclusions of Project Condign, that's taken from the executive summary. Again, you'll see at the beginning of that quote how we use the phrase UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. And we did that for a couple of reasons. If I'm being mischievous, I'll say that it sometimes made it a bit more difficult for people to use FOI if we were calling things UAP and not UFO. But the other reason is that within government, there are skeptics, there are believers, and there are a whole bunch of people in the middle. Some people in the Ministry of Defense thought UFOs were extraterrestrial. Some thought it was a complete waste of taxpayers' money, and probably the biggest number of people just didn't really know. But when we wanted to get funding for intelligence studies like Project Condign, we knew presentationally we were not going to get funding for UFO studies, but we might just, and we did, get funding for UAP studies. It's just a little sleight of hand, but that's the sort of thing that governments do. So that's the from the executive summary. This is kind of interesting. Some recommendations for pilots who encounter UAPs. And, you know, no attempt should be made to outmaneuver a UAP during interception. Well, I think it's pretty clear we're not talking about weather balloons here. And that second quote, I love. It's just basically saying, whatever it is, don't mess with it, just get out of its way. Now, this I think gets to the heart of, you know, we talk a lot about UFO secrecies and cover-ups and conspiracies. This I think gets to the heart of the question, and I think I think there was a woman who asked a question about this. Why the secrecy? Here's my take on it. This, again, is a direct quote from Project Condign's final report. And it makes it abundantly clear that the real issue here, so far as intelligence is concerned, is technology acquisition. And also the idea that if there's advanced technology that can be kind of figured out from a better understanding of the UFO phenomenon, A, it would be great to have it, but B, it would be disastrous if somebody else got it first. And again, I think you can see at the end, I guess, going back to the central theme of this conference, what does the government really know? Well, there's kind of good news and bad news. The good news is that, yeah, there are some pretty bright people working on this issue in government over the years. The bad news, as you can see from the end, is some of them are trying to make a weapon out of it. Sorry about that, but it is what it is. If the military and the intelligence community study UFOs, that's going to be the focus of interest. What can we derive from this? And I think it raises a wider question. It's interesting looking at UFO research around the world that most governments that have looked at this phenomenon, in most cases, the research effort has been embedded in the Air Force or in the DoD. And that, I think, when the history of the UFO topic comes to be written, if such a time comes, people will say that a lot of how it played out the way it played out because of who was doing it. And if you embed UFO projects in the Air Force, in the military, and if you get military intelligence doing it, this is kind of the mindset that you will get. With that in mind, it's I think, quite noteworthy that France is one country that does it a different way. In France, the government UFO investigative program has always been embedded in the French National Space Center, CNES. And I think when you get that, it gives you a slightly different focus on it. I mention that because I think sometimes we forget, and this is a point about government, that where you embed something has a huge bearing on the way in which that subject will be handled. Again, I'm just trying with my perspective on this, having done this for the Ministry of Defense, to try and give you some insights into how we viewed this subject and how we handled this. Because I hear a lot of nonsense sometimes spoken about what governments do and think and know about this. And I'm trying to give you things which are all tied back to verifiable government documents. Again, that's focusing on the kind of technology acquisition aspects of all this. A document that I have not quoted from, but I will while I remember it, is not the final report, but while Project Condign was not yet commissioned, but was being set up, some of the internal documents that basically said why we want to do this study and why we need to do it had one of the most bizarre and surreal quotes that I've ever seen in a government document on UFOs. And it said, in the absence of any overt hostility, there are perhaps three possibilities. This is a defense intelligence document. Three possibilities. A, military reconnaissance, B, scientific study, or C, tourism. Now, when I read that document, and I think it was written to me, it was part of the, this is why we need to be doing this. I probably smirked too, but in 2010, I attended 2 scientific conferences in the UK, sponsored by the Royal Society. The first one was called The Detection of Extraterrestrial Life and the Consequences for Science and Society. And the second, even more provocatively, was entitled Towards a Societal Agenda on Extraterrestrial Life. And these conferences didn't generate anywhere near the level of interest that I would expect and hope, but they were multidisciplinary conferences at which not just astronomers and astrophysicists and cosmologists came together, but psychologists, theologians, sociologists, and everyone really attempted to look at this issue of what it would mean to discover extraterrestrial life. John mentioned the work that his wife Victoria did on the religious implications of that. The religious implications of discovering extraterrestrial life was a big part of that. But the point with all that is that knowing what we know about the age of the universe and knowing what we know about star formation, it's theoretically possible that there are civilizations out there with a billion-year head start on us. We're not realistically going to have anything to teach them about science and technology, you know. But they might just be interested in the more abstract things. Our art, our literature, our music, our poetry, our political systems, and yes, our wonderful, wide, open spaces and you know, hence tourism in the document. So what sounded like a ridiculous statement that should never have found its way into an intelligence assessment on UFOs was actually a fairly, I thought, spot-on remark. But food for thought. Again, going back to themes of what governments know, this is another part of the, you know, you have to look for this thing. I mean, when the Ministry of Defense did have to release this under FOI, of course, they found a whole bunch of fairly skeptical quotes in the study, but the journalists didn't find quotes like that, because basically no one's going to plow through a 468-page report. No, everyone's going to go to just a few bits of the executive summary, but buried deeper in the report are statements like that, which again indicate that other nations are looking at this too, and there is some redaction of that document. I do remember what it says under the X's, but my security, my secrecy oath does bind me for life. And while I can talk fairly openly about things that the MOD have declassified, if they haven't declassified, I can't talk about it. I'm not a whistleblower, sorry. I teamed up with John Burroughs and Jim Penniston. That's our book on the subject. The only UFO book in history to have required security clearance from both the British and American governments. There were a few copies in the foyer, but I'm afraid they've all sold out now. But you should be able to pick up some copies fairly cheap on Amazon. So I'm going to conclude, I think, with just a few general remarks, some of which I've made before, but I think they get to the heart of really my position on this. I can tell you what UFOs aren't. I mean, it's not all swamp gas and weather balloons. There are some genuine cases that are unexplained, but we don't know for sure that they're extraterrestrial. That is one of a number of competing theories that's been looked at in government, but no definitive conclusion, certainly so far as the British government, has been reached. We can't rule it out, but we don't have any smoking gun. Yes, we are interested in the UFO phenomenon. The primary reason for that, because our project has been embedded in the military and defense, is not scientific curiosity, it is technology acquisition. If there are UFOs, we would very much like to know about the energy source, the propulsion system, the aerodynamics, the radar signature, and we'd like to build one ourselves. Why is any of this important? I think the question of whether or not we're alone in the cosmos, and the related question of whether or not we're being visited, those really are some of the biggest and most profound questions we can ask ourselves. And unlike other big, profound philosophical questions, is there a God? Does consciousness survive death of the body? Those sorts of things. They are probably unknowable. But the question of whether or not there's life elsewhere in the universe, and maybe whether we're being visited, those, it seems to me, are big and profound questions that we are capable of asking. Some of the answers might be in government archives. Some of the answers might be within our reach, tantalizingly close, through science, through astronomy. Yuri Milner now putting $100 million of fresh money into Breakthrough Listen to beef up the search for extraterrestrial intelligence using radio telescopes. The story just in the last week about a possible alien megastructure. Have we detected the first Dyson sphere that people in some parts of the astronomical community who've thought about this think that these things might exist? If there are civilizations out there with these sorts of technologies, we are just now getting to the level where the technology to detect them will be within our grasp. Yuri Milner and his money might do it. The Square Kilometre Array radio telescope might do it. When it's fully constructed, it will have the power to detect something like an airport radar out to a distance of 50 light years. You know, if there are these civilizations out there, we are tantalizingly close to detecting their fingerprints. So with that remark, I'm going to conclude and take some questions, but finally, and with apologies to Nick Redfern, I do just have to make one final announcement, which plays to what governments do and don't know about UFOs and how governments sometimes treat witnesses. Sorry to say, men in black don't exist. Thank you very much.
Very cool, ladies and gentlemen. Fascinating. Okay, we'll take a few questions now, and then we're going to get all of our speakers on stage so that they'll be in one place and people can ask questions again. So quickly, do we have any questions for Mr. Pope out there? Right here in front.
Yeah, what kind of information have you gathered from Soviet Union and Chinese counterparts regarding their government?
Surprisingly little. When people ask me, looking back at my time on the UFO project, what do I think my greatest mistakes were? I think that taking a national as opposed to a global perspective on this was my biggest mistake. we liaised very little, even with friendly governments. Now, of course, the former Soviet Union and China posed challenges of their own in any case through not being open to sharing information with us on any subject. Even with allies, you find this. Now, I was a victim of my own terms of reference here. I was only authorized to investigate sightings within the United Kingdom's air defense region, but I should have taken a wider perspective. In my defense, I will say that almost every other UFO project that you can think of has taken a similarly nationalistic approach. That's why some people, of course, have said that maybe the way forward is to give it to the UN. But I tell you, the UN don't want it. Down here?
Yes, you spoke about an 8-year period of time of declassification, and I was wondering what the pressure is that's causing them to do this process.
The pressure in the UK came entirely from the Freedom of Information Act. When the UK got its FOI, it was enacted in 2000. It came fully into force across all government departments in 2005. When the Ministry of Defense, like all government departments, had to give progress reports to the Information Commissioner on what efforts they were making, how quickly they were turning around requests, they did league tables, and consistently more people asked the Ministry of Defense about UFOs than any other subject, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and for that reason, the MOD decided to proactively release the entire archive. Now, it took them 8 years, and they said that they finished in June 2013, but a few months ago it was announced that they'd found more files. Those will be coming out in either later this year or early to mid next year. So the pressure was entirely FOI driven. There.
I find it very interesting that NASA has released, a week or two ago, they put out their finding that there was detection of water on Mars. And now this latest thing, and it's not really related to NASA, about that star, the possibility they're investigating it. I get the sense, and I'm wondering what your opinion is on this, that maybe they're beginning to open the door a little bit on this whole thing about, leading to a bigger thing in terms of Mars and other evidence. I know they focus on microbial life, but I'm just wondering if there's an incentive, maybe on NASA's part because of the funding issues.
I certainly often hear the theory that there is almost an acclimatization, a preparing of the ground ahead of some big announcement. I personally don't agree with that theory. I think that if one examines in history any period of time, there will be stories like that, but we kind of lose sight of the old ones. My perception, having certainly met people from NASA and discussed this, is that if they discovered extraterrestrial life, whether it's microbial or intelligent, they would shout it from the rooftops. And certainly the SETI community are saying, if we pick up a signal, first we verify, and second we tell the world. And again, NASA's funding, which John showed in his slide, went down so much. Saying we found extraterrestrials might push it back up again. And so I think if they found it, they would shout it.
Just before the final UK report came out, can you answer whether or not they were aware of the Brookings Institute analysis that was done in the United States?
We had seen it, and I think there was a copy of it kicking around in one of the old files. But we had pretty much everything just kicking. We had an old copy of the Condign report kicking around. So yeah, we'd certainly seen it. Sure. Pardon me?
How crop circles fit into your analysis?
Okay. The question is how crop circles fit into my analysis. I am a crop circle skeptic. I did look at it briefly when I was in the Ministry of Defense because of the perceived link with UFOs, but I was not able to put any significant resources into it, and I'm afraid that nothing I saw really convinced me there was anything anomalous. I know a lot of people will disagree with me on that. So with apologies, I think that was the last of my personal questions, but I think all of our speakers are going to gather now, so there's time for more questions with all of us, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Pope. Now, if you'll give us a minute to get set up on stage, we'll have more questions from all of you.